Black doctor turned away from a restaurant. Then a surprising call changes everything. Dr. Amara Phillips had become accustomed to living a life defined by control, precision, and the quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. At 38, she was in the prime of her career, a respected emergency room physician in one of the city's most prestigious hospitals. She had earned her place through years of hard work, unrelenting dedication, and an innate ability to remain calm under pressure. There was something about the chaos of the ER, the frantic energy, the constant rush, that had always felt like home to Amara. She could compartmentalize the noise, the pain, the fear, and focus only on what mattered: saving lives. It was a role that required immense mental strength and emotional resilience, both of which Amara had in abundance. She had long since learned to tune out the incessant hum of racial microaggressions, the sideways glances, and the occasional backhanded compliment. "You're so articulate for a Black woman," they would say, as if her intelligence was an anomaly to be admired. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Growing up in a predominantly Black neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, Amara was used to being an anomaly. Her parents, both educators, had instilled in her the value of hard work and perseverance from a young age. They had always told her that the world might not give her the opportunities she deserved, but it was her job to carve out her own space and claim those opportunities regardless. Her mother had a saying, "Don't wait for the world to open doors for you, Amara. Knock on them until they break." It was a lesson she'd taken to heart. Her childhood was filled with moments of self-reliance. Amara was often the only Black student in her advanced classes, the only Black girl in the ballet troupe, the only Black intern in her medical rotations. She had faced 1,000 challenges, but each hurdle only made her more determined, more disciplined, more aware of her surroundings. She had learned early on that in many spaces, especially the ones that mattered, she had to be not only good, but exceptional. And exceptional she was. She graduated at the top of her class in medical school, aced her board exams, and quickly became a leader in her field. But this success had come at a cost. The social world that existed outside the hospital doors felt much more difficult to navigate. While Amara could hold her own professionally, she could banter with surgeons, discuss complex cases with ease, and give lectures to residents. Her personal life had always been an area of quiet struggle. She lived alone in a well-appointed apartment in a quieter part of the city. Her life, while full of accolades, was solitary. Dinner invitations were rare, as her colleagues tended to socialize in ways that she found somewhat alienating. They often organized outings in upscale restaurants or at wine bars, spaces that she occasionally found difficult to enjoy fully, given her sense of isolation. There was a kind of social currency in these spaces that she was never quite able to grasp. She was friendly with her colleagues, but there were always unspoken boundaries, always the unacknowledged divide. It was the small things that hurt. The way her colleague Jennifer had commented, "You know, Amara, it's so nice to see someone like you in this field," after she'd secured a major research grant. There was no malice behind it, but it stung just the same. Despite her success in the medical world, Amara had never quite found her footing in the social world outside it. She had tried to make friends, tried to belong, but there was always that invisible barrier, the one made of assumption and bias, the one that no one ever explicitly addressed but that everyone silently understood. So, she retreated into her work, letting the rhythm of her hospital shifts fill the spaces in her life that friends, family, or even romantic relationships might have occupied. Still, Amara was content with her solitude. Or, at least, she had convinced herself that she was. She had always prided herself on her independence. Work was her sanctuary, and she enjoyed the challenge of saving lives, of making quick decisions under pressure, of offering the kind of life-saving interventions that made people see her as irreplaceable. Being a doctor was what she was meant to do. But every now and then, there was an undercurrent of longing, a desire for something more than the sterile, high-paced environment of the ER. That evening, Amara had planned to do something she didn't often do: take a break from work, from her well-worn routine, and enjoy a night out. She hadn't had a proper evening off in weeks, and the weariness from long shifts, missed meals, and sleepless nights was starting to take its toll. Her friends had often teased her for her single-mindedness, for her tendency to immerse herself in work until it felt like she was no longer living her own life, but simply existing in it. Tonight, though, she was determined to break that cycle, even if just for a few hours. She had heard about a new restaurant that had garnered attention for its innovative menu and chic interior, and despite herself, she was curious. It wasn't just the food she was interested in. It was the idea of doing something ordinary for once, going to a place where she could relax and enjoy an evening, like anyone else. In the quiet moments leading up to her evening out, as Amara prepared herself for what she hoped would be a restorative night, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She had grown used to seeing her own reflection without much thought, her dark eyes, framed by well-groomed brows, her skin glowing under the soft light of her bathroom. She smirked to herself, thinking that even though she had become accustomed to her appearance, her confidence still required constant maintenance. The world often told her that she was too much of this or not enough of that, too black, too proud, too assertive, not feminine enough in the ways some expected her to be. Yet, there was a strength in her that she could never relinquish. Amara dressed carefully for the evening, selecting a sleek black dress that balanced elegance and professionalism and that subtly hinted at her style. She didn't want to stand out in a way that made her feel uncomfortable, but neither did she want to be overlooked. She was proud of how far she had come, proud of her hard-won success, and tonight, she wanted to enjoy that sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the food or the ambience. It was about creating a space for herself, however fleeting, where she could be unapologetically herself, without the usual expectations that society often placed on her. As she arrived at the restaurant, Amara couldn't help but notice the aura of sophistication that seemed to hum through the air. The clean lines of the space, the soft lighting, the hum of conversation, it all felt almost out of place in her routine. It was a reminder that, for all her success, there were still places where she didn't feel fully at ease. But tonight, that was going to change. Tonight, she was going to have a simple, pleasant evening, away from the pressures of work and society, away from the constant scrutiny of what it meant to be a Black woman in a world that often saw her as a novelty or a challenge, rather than a peer. She approached the hostess stand with quiet anticipation, her steps echoing on the polished floor. But as the young woman behind the desk looked up, Amara immediately sensed that something was wrong. The following days after Amara's visit to the restaurant were filled with a sense of disquiet. She had tried to shake off the sting of the hostess's dismissal, hoping it was simply a misunderstanding, a trivial blip in an otherwise pleasant evening. After all, the world was full of little annoyances, weren't they? This wasn't the first time she had been ignored, dismissed, or subtly rejected because of the color of her skin. Over the years, she had become accustomed to such encounters, chalking them up to ignorance, indifference, or, at worst, unconscious bias. It was simply part of living in a world that didn't always see her as she saw herself. But as the days wore on, the more Amara reflected on that evening, the more the feeling of being slighted grew. It wasn't just the curt refusal at the hostess desk. It wasn't just the way the young woman had barely looked at her. It was the overwhelming sense that she had been invisible, unworthy of even the most basic courtesy. Amara was used to being treated as if she were less than, but this felt different. This wasn't just about being seen as an outsider in a space where she didn't belong. It was about being ignored, a small but potent message that she wasn't worth the time or attention, that she was, in fact, invisible in a way that others were not. She had thought about the many times in her life when she had been told she was too much, too loud, too forceful, too assertive. As a child, she had been told she was too smart for her own good, or that she talked too much for a girl. As an adult, it had often felt like her accomplishments and ambitions were viewed with suspicion or begrudging acceptance. She had spent years fighting to prove that she belonged, to show that she was more than her skin, more than her race. And yet, time and again, she had been made to feel that her presence was a problem, something that others had to adjust to, rather than something that was inherently worthy of respect. What bothered her most was that the hostess hadn't even seemed to see her as a person, Just another name on a reservation list, another face that didn't fit the mold. She had smiled politely, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a polite mask that concealed a deeper indifference. Amara thought of how, in her years as a doctor, she had been taught to read people, not just their symptoms or their medical histories, but their nonverbal cues, the subtle ways in which their emotions were conveyed. She knew how to read body language, how to decode a glance, a posture, the way someone's voice would betray their true thoughts. And from the moment the hostess had looked at her, Amara had known she was unwelcome. Amara felt the familiar knot of frustration tightening in her chest. It was a feeling she had grown too accustomed to in her life. But this time, the frustration was sharper. This wasn't a vague, abstract injustice. It was personal. She had felt it physically, a sharp pang that settled deep inside her gut, like a visceral reminder that despite her accomplishments, despite her ability to save lives and command a room, she was still perceived as other. This wasn't a hypothetical issue, one of distant social justice debates or academic discourse. It was real. It was here. And it was happening to her. For days, Amara tried to let the incident slide, convincing herself that it wasn't a big deal. She had more important things to focus on: her patients, her work, her career. She had built her life around the assumption that, while the world might not always be fair, it was manageable. She had learned to accept that people would always have biases, that some would treat her differently because of her race, because of their preconceived notions about who she was. She had learned to rise above it, to push it aside and focus on the task at hand. But this was different. This wasn't just an isolated event. This was part of a larger, insidious pattern, a pattern she could no longer ignore. The night at the restaurant was simply a reflection of the biases that ran deep within society, within the very institutions she worked within. It was a reminder that no matter how many accolades she received, no matter how many lives she saved, she would always have to fight harder to prove her worth in spaces where others didn't have to. Amara sat at her kitchen table one evening, the weight of her thoughts making the room feel smaller, more oppressive. She stared at the half-drunk glass of wine in front of her, swirling it slowly, but not really seeing it. Her fingers ran absent-mindedly over the stem of the glass as her mind raced. Why had she been denied service? Was it because she hadn't fit the restaurant's idea of a customer? Was it her blackness? Or was it something else entirely, a mix of factors that Amara had seen too many times to count, each one adding another layer to the unspoken truths that lay beneath the surface of daily life? Was it a subtle signal to her? A reminder that even the most accomplished and educated people like her were still perceived as other? Her phone buzzed suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text message from her mother. "How was your dinner out, baby? Take care of yourself, okay? You deserve a break." Amara sighed, rubbing her temples. Her mother had always been a rock for her, a constant source of encouragement, but she didn't understand. She couldn't understand because she hadn't lived through the same experiences. Her mother, though a woman of color, had never had to navigate the complexities of being a Black woman in a predominantly white medical field. She had never had to endure the subtle microaggressions that Amara faced every day, the sideways glances and dismissive comments that chipped away at one's sense of self-worth over time. Amara typed a quick reply. "It was fine, Mom. Just tired. I'll talk to you tomorrow." She put the phone down, the words ringing hollow in her mind. She had said the same thing to her mother for years, but the truth was, nothing ever really felt fine. She wasn't just tired, she was frustrated. She wasn't just disappointed, she was angry. She wanted something more than this life of constant emotional labor, of always being the bigger person, of silently enduring the small, systemic indignities that came with being Black in a world that didn't want her to be seen as equal. It was in that moment of quiet contemplation, as the weight of the evening settled in around her, that Amara made a decision. She would not let this go. She had a right to be heard, a right to seek justice, even in the smallest of ways. The refusal wasn't just a personal affront, it was part of a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed. She wasn't going to accept the status quo any longer. She was going to make the restaurant, that restaurant, accountable. Not for herself, but for the countless others who had walked into places like this only to be met with indifference or outright rejection. The more she thought about it, the more Amara realized that this wasn't about her pride or about seeking some small apology from the restaurant. It was about making sure that this incident wasn't forgotten, that it wasn't dismissed as a minor inconvenience. This was about taking a stand, about ensuring that the world knew that people like her had a voice, and that voice would not be silenced. Amara opened her laptop and typed out an email to the restaurant. She explained, in clear and concise terms, what had happened, how she had been refused service without explanation, how the experience had left her feeling marginalized and invisible. She asked to speak with the manager. She demanded that they take responsibility, not just for her case, but for the broader issues of racial bias that often went unaddressed. She hit send, feeling a surge of resolve, even as a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. This was the first step, and while she wasn't sure what would come of it, she knew it was the right one. The next morning, her phone rang. It was a number from the restaurant, and Amara's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath before answering, ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed Amara's email to the restaurant felt strangely charged with a sense of anticipation. She wasn't sure what to expect. She had taken the step of writing to the management, not just out of frustration, but out of a deep-seated belief that change had to start somewhere, and it might as well start with her. She could have chosen to ignore the slight, to let it fade into the background like so many others she had endured in her life. But something about this moment, this particular instance of being denied, felt different. It wasn't just the act of exclusion, it was the casualness of it, the disinterest that was directed at her, as though she didn't matter. That was what unsettled her. That was what gnawed at her. And in some ways, it felt even more personal than any of the overt racism she had experienced in her life. Amara had grown accustomed to the subtle nature of the world's prejudice. The sideways glances, the mistaken identity moments, the assumptions about her career and background, the disbelief when she spoke of her achievements, all of those things had shaped her worldview. She had learned to move past them, to work twice as hard to earn the respect she deserved, to assert her place in rooms where people like her were often only considered as an afterthought. But the indifference that had met her at the restaurant had unsettled her in a way that was harder to shake off. The response to her email came sooner than she had anticipated, and it was not what she expected. A manager named Derek Thompson reached out to her directly. His tone was one of genuine apology, more so than any cursory acknowledgement she had expected. He admitted that he had no idea the incident had occurred and expressed his deep regret that she had been made to feel unwelcome at his establishment. Derek's message was warm and apologetic, though it had a slight undertone of nervousness. He seemed to be genuinely concerned, but also unsure about what had gone wrong. There was a willingness in his words, but Amara was skeptical. She had heard apologies before, and while they often felt insincere, there was something different about the way this one had been delivered. Amara didn't want just an apology. She didn't need an acknowledgement that she had been wronged. She needed more than that. She needed to understand why it had happened, why it hadn't been recognized earlier, and how the restaurant planned to change its approach to guests who didn't fit a certain mold. She didn't expect Derek to have all the answers, but she wanted to be sure that the system that allowed for such bias to thrive was being examined, not just covered up with pleasantries. Derek had offered to meet in person to discuss the matter further, and though Amara hesitated at first, she agreed. There was a nervous flutter in her stomach as she prepared for the meeting. She had to be sure of her intentions, ready to communicate her thoughts clearly, and to challenge him on the deeper, systemic issues that had allowed such an incident to occur in the first place. She had thought long and hard about how to approach this conversation. She wasn't interested in a confrontation, but she also wasn't interested in a meaningless exchange. She wanted real change, real reflection. The day of the meeting, Amara felt the weight of her decision. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this wasn't just about a restaurant. It was about a culture. It was about the larger societal issue of racial bias that ran deep, silently affecting interactions and shaping lives. As much as she wanted to make sure the restaurant's management understood what had gone wrong, she knew that her actions could echo beyond this one instance. She could turn this into something more, something that could challenge the status quo. She arrived at the restaurant an hour early, needing time to calm her nerves before she would face Derek, before she would put into words the frustration, confusion, and anger that had been bubbling inside her since that fateful night. The restaurant, NT, had a sleek, modern design, with minimalist decor and ambient lighting that cast soft shadows across the room. The place was nearly empty at this time of day, its polished floors gleaming and the quiet hum of classical music filling the space. Amara had to admit it was a beautiful place, but as she looked around, the thought of how she had been turned away here, how she had been dismissed, how she had felt like an outsider in a space that was designed to be welcoming, it hit her once more. This was a space that was supposed to be for everyone, and yet it wasn't. She walked up to the hostess stand, which was now staffed by a different woman, younger and more energetic. Amara had no desire to bring attention to herself, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of déjà vu. The woman greeted her warmly, asking if she had a reservation. Amara nodded and mentioned that she was meeting Derek Thompson, the manager. There was a slight pause, as if the hostess was recognizing the name, but wasn't entirely sure why it was significant. She then quickly checked Amara's name in the system, and with a soft, almost too polite smile, led her to a table in the back, as though to avoid drawing too much attention to her. Sitting down, Amara felt her anxiety level rise. It was hard to shake the feeling of being out of place, and yet, she was trying to stay grounded. She glanced at her watch. Derek was running a little late. The minutes stretched on, and her mind raced with thoughts. She felt both vulnerable and empowered. She was confronting a problem head-on, not letting it slide. She had been wronged, and now, she was taking responsibility for making sure others wouldn't have to go through the same thing. Derek arrived shortly after, his face flushed from what appeared to be a rush of activity in the kitchen. He apologized for being late and introduced himself in a way that suggested he was unsure of what to expect from this conversation. Amara studied him as he sat down. He was in his late 40s, tall, and wore the well-kept appearance of someone who managed an upscale restaurant. His attire was neat, but there was something about his demeanor that signaled discomfort. Perhaps he was nervous, or perhaps it was the weight of the conversation he knew was coming. "I appreciate you meeting with me, Dr. Phillips," Derek said, his voice polite but uncertain. "I want to be very clear that we take what happened very seriously. I'm deeply sorry for the experience you had here. I can only imagine how upsetting it must have been for you." Amara nodded, but she didn't immediately respond. She had to be careful. She had spent too much of her life apologizing for things that weren't her fault, making room for others' discomfort, and trying to explain away things that others should already understand. This wasn't the time to do that. She had to be direct, honest, and forceful without being combative. "I appreciate your apology, Derek," she said finally. "But what I need to understand is why it happened. Why was I turned away without explanation? Why was I made to feel invisible in a space that was supposed to be welcoming to everyone?" Derek's eyes widened slightly, and he leaned forward. "I honestly don't know. I wasn't there when it happened, and I can't speak to what exactly occurred, but I know that this isn't the kind of environment we strive to create. I've been going over the staff training materials, trying to figure out where things went wrong. I can assure you that this isn't something we condone." Amara's heart beat a little faster. There was something in his words, a hint of concern, that made her realize he wasn't just placating her. There was sincerity, but there was also a discomfort that mirrored her own. She wanted to believe that Derek was trying to change things, but her skepticism ran deep. "And what about your staff?" she pressed, her voice even but firm. "What kind of training do they have when it comes to bias? Have you addressed the ways in which racism, even implicit racism, can show up in places like this? The issue isn't just about one interaction. It's about a culture that allows incidents like mine to happen in the first place." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, nodding. "You're right. It's not just about the one incident, but about the broader issues that we may not be seeing. I'll admit, I hadn't thought about it in those terms until now. But I'm committed to making this right. We'll be implementing more comprehensive training, and I want to make sure that everyone on staff understands the importance of recognizing and addressing bias." Amara's mind raced, her emotions shifting from frustration to a strange form of cautious hope. She had started this conversation expecting little more than a polite apology, but now she was hearing the beginning of something more, a commitment to change, to introspection. But even as she felt the spark of hope, she couldn't help but wonder how deep this change would go, whether it would be real, or whether it would remain just another in a long line of well-meaning but ineffective gestures. But for the first time since the incident, she felt as though she had been heard. And that, in itself, was a victory. In the days following her meeting with Derek, Amara found herself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, the conversation had gone better than she expected. Derek's apology had felt genuine, and his willingness to engage in an open discussion about the systemic issues at play had been a rare moment of hope in what often seemed like a relentless cycle of dismissal and indifference. The restaurant had promised to implement more thorough training, to examine its practices, and to focus on fostering an environment free from implicit bias. But on the other hand, Amara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that change was more complicated than a few training sessions or a couple of earnest conversations. The commitment Derek expressed felt like a small victory, but it also felt fragile, like a half-formed idea that might crumble under pressure. Amara had seen this before: promises made, gestures offered, but no real follow-through. She had witnessed similar attempts at change in her medical career, in her interactions with colleagues, and in her community. Change, when it came to confronting racism or bias, was often met with resistance and defensiveness. It was easy for people to say the right things in the moment, but much harder for them to confront their own ingrained prejudices, to face the discomfort of reevaluating the way they had been operating for years. As Amara sat with her thoughts, she found herself struggling with a sense of doubt. She had wanted to believe in the possibility of real change, to believe that Derek's words could translate into tangible actions. But a voice in the back of her mind questioned whether this moment was just another cycle, another time when the rhetoric of equality would be offered up without real commitment to the hard work required to dismantle deeply rooted biases. The discomfort she felt wasn't just about the incident at the restaurant, but about the broader societal structures that allowed such incidents to occur in the first place. The pressure of the situation began to weigh on her as the weeks passed. Amara threw herself into her work, but the underlying tension was hard to ignore. She couldn't completely block out the conversation she had had with Derek, or the frustration that had bubbled up when she realized how difficult it was to push for change in an institution like the restaurant. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how familiar this struggle was. She had fought similar battles in her career as a doctor, fighting to be taken seriously in a field dominated by white, male authority figures, constantly having to prove her worth, her competence, her right to be there. She had fought to make space for herself in rooms that didn't seem to want her there. And now, she was doing it again, but this time, it wasn't just about her. It was about a broader societal issue that impacted countless others who had been turned away, ignored, or diminished for reasons that had nothing to do with their abilities or worth. But Amara wasn't sure she was ready for another fight. She wasn't sure she could bear the emotional toll of pushing too hard, of facing more resistance, more barriers, more moments of being told, "Not now," or "We'll get to it later." She had spent so much of her life pushing through the exhaustion, doing the emotional labor, carrying the weight of not only her own experiences, but the experiences of others as well. In a way, it was as if she had become a vessel for other people's pain, and now, she found herself questioning if she could carry that weight much longer. Still, there was something in the back of her mind that refused to let go. The truth was, Amara was exhausted, but she was also driven. She had seen change before, small but significant victories that had shifted the culture around her. And as much as she was tired of fighting, she was even more tired of watching the cycle repeat itself. She wasn't going to be another person who let an injustice slide by because it was too much to confront. This wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about a system that perpetuated inequality, a system that perpetuated the idea that people like her didn't belong in certain spaces. And so, Amara began to push back against her doubts, to dig deeper into her own resilience. She realized that change wasn't going to happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't going to happen by simply making a polite complaint and walking away. If she truly wanted to see things shift, she needed to be proactive. She needed to make sure that the conversation didn't end with a promise. She needed to follow through. But as she took her next steps, she also realized that she couldn't do it alone. Amara reached out to a few colleagues and friends who were also aware of the subtle biases and inequities that permeated the spaces they worked in. They spoke about their own experiences, shared moments of being ignored, questioned, or dismissed because of their race or gender. These conversations gave Amara a sense of solidarity, a feeling that she was part of a larger movement of people who were willing to fight for change, even if it meant facing resistance and discomfort. Together, they began brainstorming ways to amplify their voices, to challenge systems that allowed inequities to thrive unchecked. Amara's first step was to return to the restaurant, not as a guest this time, but as someone who would be asking tough questions. She had already spoken to Derek about her concerns, but she knew that one meeting wasn't enough. She had to dig deeper to ensure that the restaurant's changes wouldn't be just surface level. She asked Derek for a tour of the kitchen, the staff rooms, the areas where decisions were being made. She wanted to understand how the restaurant functioned, how policies were enforced, and where opportunities for growth or bias were most likely to occur. Derek had agreed, albeit a bit hesitantly, but Amara felt that it was an important part of the process. If they were going to make real change, it had to come from within the system itself. The tour revealed much more than Amara had anticipated. As she walked through the back of the house, she noticed the stark contrast between the shiny, polished dining areas and the tired, worn staff quarters. The staff, who were predominantly Black and Latino, were crammed into a small, cramped break room. The atmosphere back there was tense, with little space for conversation or community building. Amara noticed how differently the servers were treated from the chefs or managers. There were clear divisions in the hierarchy, not just in terms of job functions, but in the way people were valued. Amara asked Derek about the restaurant's hiring practices. She was told that they were an equal opportunity employer, that they took care to hire a diverse staff. But as she observed the dynamics, she couldn't help but feel a sense of skepticism. Yes, the staff was diverse, but the power was clearly concentrated at the top, in the hands of people who didn't understand the unique challenges that the lower-level staff faced. She asked about mentorship programs for employees, about opportunities for upward mobility, but Derek seemed uncertain of the specifics. It was clear that, while Derek was committed to doing the right thing, the restaurant was still in the early stages of confronting these deeper issues. Amara left the meeting feeling conflicted. On the one hand, she had uncovered valuable information, and it had reinforced her belief that true change would require a complete overhaul of the restaurant's internal culture. On the other hand, the task ahead felt daunting, even overwhelming. She had just scratched the surface, but now she knew how much work was required. Amara's conversations with Derek continued over the following weeks, and while she appreciated his efforts, she began to realize that real progress would take time. There were no quick fixes here. The changes they were talking about, cultural shifts, systemic adjustments, required a long-term commitment from everyone involved. And that would require more than just a handful of good intentions. It would require constant pressure, constant evaluation, and an ongoing commitment to accountability. In the meantime, Amara continued her advocacy work, reaching out to other restaurants, other institutions, to encourage them to think more deeply about their biases and practices. She knew this battle was far from over, but as she moved forward, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She might not be able to change everything overnight, but she could start with one place, one conversation, one shift in perspective. And that, she knew, was the only way to bring about lasting change. For weeks, Amara felt a growing sense of accomplishment. It had started with one simple, seemingly insignificant incident, a refusal of service at a restaurant, and yet, here she was, pushing for real change. Her efforts had seemed to culminate in a tangible victory. Derek, the restaurant manager, had followed through on his promise to make systemic changes. Staff training had been revamped with a focus on unconscious bias and inclusivity. Amara had seen real shifts in the culture of the restaurant as the management team began to take a more proactive approach to addressing the issues she had raised. There were small signs of progress: new posters in the staff room, updated diversity statements, even the implementation of a mentorship program for junior employees to rise through the ranks. The restaurant had taken steps that, on the surface, appeared to be the beginning of a meaningful transformation. Amara had also made her mark on the conversation. Her insistence on going beyond surface-level apologies had opened doors to larger discussions about diversity and inclusivity in the restaurant industry. Her emails to the restaurant's corporate office had been well received, and there were murmurs within the hospitality community that the restaurant chain was setting a new standard. For a brief moment, Amara allowed herself to believe that her efforts had led to real change, that her victory was final, that the problems she had highlighted were on their way to being solved. But as she sat in the restaurant one afternoon, reviewing some new training materials Derek had sent over for her feedback, a nagging doubt crept up in the back of her mind. The restaurant had certainly made adjustments, and the rhetoric around inclusivity had grown louder. However, something didn't sit right with her. There was a sense that these changes were not as deep or as permanent as she had hoped. In some ways, the changes felt superficial, well-meaning, yes, but still more about appearance than substance. She wondered whether these changes were being implemented because they were genuinely necessary or because they were a reaction to the bad publicity her complaint had generated. Was it about accountability, or was it about saving face? As Amara thought about it more, she began to realize that the promises Derek had made, while sincere, were not enough. There was no clear timeline for the changes to be fully implemented. The training, although improved, still felt disconnected from the lived experiences of the staff. The mentorship programs were still in their infancy, with no clear metrics of success or evaluation. Amara felt a creeping unease that the restaurant was taking a check-the-box approach to fixing a much larger issue, rather than tackling the root causes of the problem. What troubled her even more was how little had changed in terms of leadership. While the staff was now being trained on inclusivity and bias, the management team, including Derek, remained largely unchanged in their approach. Derek, as well-intentioned as he seemed, was still the same person who had failed to recognize the issue in the first place. He still seemed somewhat detached from the daily struggles that the staff faced. There was no indication that the leadership had been asked to deeply reflect on how their own biases might have contributed to the culture that allowed incidents like Amara's to happen. The restaurant's policies may have changed on paper, but the culture remained predominantly the same. Amara reached out to a few of the restaurant staff members, those she had gotten to know over the weeks, especially the Black and Latino workers. She had connected with them during her visits, and she had encouraged them to speak up, to be part of the process. When she checked in with them, however, the responses she received were far from encouraging. Many of the employees were still skeptical about the changes being made. The training sessions felt like a perfunctory exercise, something they were required to sit through without much regard for how it could be applied to their day-to-day lives. There were whispers among the staff that the upper management had grown complacent, that the real issues, the deep-seated biases, the unequal distribution of power, were still left largely unaddressed. One particular conversation with Maria, a waitress who had been working at the restaurant for nearly 4 years, stood out. Maria had been friendly and open with Amara from the beginning. She had listened attentively during the initial meetings about the incident and had even expressed gratitude that someone was taking the issue seriously. But when Amara asked her how things had been since the changes were implemented, Maria's response was guarded. "It's better, I guess," Maria said, her voice flat. "But I don't know. They gave us some new training stuff, but it's mostly just buzzwords. I don't feel like anyone really gets it, you know? They don't understand what it's like to work here, to be in a position where we don't have a say in anything. I don't know if they really care about changing that. They just want us to smile and say everything's fine now." Amara listened intently, her heart sinking as she realized that her sense of victory was more fragile than she had thought. She had believed that her involvement in the process had led to a genuine change in the culture of the restaurant. But as Maria's words echoed in her mind, Amara could no longer deny that there were deeper, more fundamental issues at play, issues that went beyond a few training sessions and surface-level policies. The restaurant may have made some changes on paper, but the actual culture, the unwritten norms, the dynamics of power, hadn't shifted in a way that would lead to long-term progress. It was then that Amara began to understand a painful truth: achieving the visible sign S of success was not the same as achieving true change. It was easy to celebrate small victories, to pat herself on the back for getting a company to implement diversity training and issue public apologies. But those victories were hollow if they didn't address the systemic problems that ran far deeper than a training manual could fix. Amara couldn't help but think back to her medical career, how she had, over the years, navigated a system that often celebrated diversity in theory, but didn't always act on it in practice. She had been part of many initiatives that seemed to promise inclusion but often failed to make a significant impact. These were the same initiatives that brought the same well-meaning individuals together, only to see the issues re-emerge once the initial excitement died down. The root causes of inequality, whether in healthcare or hospitality, were entrenched in the systems and structures that govern the institutions. Change wasn't just about implementing policies, it was about transforming the very nature of those systems, and that was something far more complex and difficult to achieve. Amara felt a deep sense of disappointment as the reality of her situation set in. She had worked so hard to bring about change, and yet she was beginning to understand that she had only scratched the surface. She had done the work, put in the effort, pushed for change. But the restaurant's leadership had not fully embraced the difficult and uncomfortable work of confronting their own biases. The staff still felt unheard, and many of the issues that had led to the incident in the first place were still festering beneath the surface. It was a bitter realization, one that left her questioning the limits of her own influence. What had she really accomplished? Had she actually succeeded in changing anything, or had she merely exposed a problem that was much larger than she could handle on her own? As much as she hated to admit it, Amara knew that real change couldn't happen just through one person's efforts. She had to broaden her perspective. She had to involve more voices, more people who were willing to hold the system accountable, and more people who could push for change beyond the surface level. The sense of failure was overwhelming, but it also sparked a new determination in Amara. She wasn't finished yet. She knew now that this fight would take more time, more energy, and more persistence than she had originally thought. But this wasn't just about one restaurant or one instance. It was about a larger, deeper issue that required constant work, vigilance, and a commitment to justice. She wasn't going to let the changes she had pushed for be forgotten or watered down. This was just the beginning of a much longer journey. In the weeks following her realization that the restaurant's changes were more superficial than substantive, Amara began to feel the full weight of the emotional toll that her activism had taken. She had entered this journey with a clear sense of purpose, to push for accountability, to ensure that incidents of bias and racism were not tolerated, and to advocate for long-term change. But as the days wore on, Amara began to realize that her quest for justice had come with unforeseen consequences. What had once felt like a moral obligation to speak up, to make a difference, now felt more like an exhausting burden. The first sign of this shift came when Amara found herself increasingly withdrawn from her personal life. Her friends, who had been supportive of her efforts, began to notice her growing fatigue. Conversations that used to be lighthearted and filled with laughter now felt forced. She couldn't shake the constant anxiety that had become her companion, the mental exhaustion that kept her up at night. It was as if every part of her life was being overshadowed by the fight for justice. Every time she picked up the phone, it felt like another confrontation, another conversation about the restaurant, another plea for change. Even though she was determined to continue, Amara began to realize that she was losing pieces of herself in the process. At work, Amara's sense of isolation deepened. Her colleagues in the medical field, who had been somewhat sympathetic to her cause, were now starting to pull back. Many of them had expressed admiration for her courage in speaking out, but that admiration began to feel hollow as the weeks went by. There was no support, no follow-through, just a sense that they had offered their applause and expected her to handle everything on her own. She had long since stopped seeking advice or comfort from them because she knew what they would say. "You're doing great, but you can't let this consume you. You need to take care of yourself." As if it were that simple. As if the battle she was fighting could be set aside like a book left unread on a shelf. But Amara could not simply walk away. The people who had been impacted by the restaurant's racism, the staff who were still bearing the brunt of subtle biases in the workplace, had become her responsibility. She felt a deep, almost suffocating sense of duty to continue pressing for change. The restaurant had been slow to embrace the deeper aspects of change, and it seemed to be reverting to old habits. Amara had become obsessed with ensuring that the promises Derek had made were fulfilled, but she was increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress. There were no answers to her more pointed questions. She would write emails, leave voicemails, and follow up, only to receive generic responses or, worse, no response at all. The mental and emotional fatigue began to bleed into her physical health. She had always been a diligent doctor, someone who believed in the importance of self-care and maintaining a healthy work-life balance. But now, her body seemed to be rebelling against the constant stress. Sleep, which had once been a sanctuary, became elusive. Her appetite fluctuated between disinterest and overeating as a way of coping with the emotional void she felt. At times, her head would ache so profoundly that it felt like her thoughts were racing faster than her body could keep up. There were moments when she thought she might be on the brink of burnout, but her drive kept pushing her forward. She couldn't afford to slow down, not when so many people were relying on her to keep pushing for change. But as the days passed, Amara couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of resentment. She had sacrificed so much of herself, her time, her emotional energy, her physical well-being. And for what? The restaurant was making cosmetic changes, but deep down, she knew it wasn't enough. She had tried to initiate real dialogue, to expose the gaps in leadership and the absence of true accountability, but it felt like no one was listening anymore. The promises made by Derek and the restaurant's upper management seemed increasingly empty. They were still using buzzwords, still talking about inclusivity and diversity, as if they could fix everything with slogans and hashtags. The heart of the problem, the deep-seated culture of exclusion, remained intact, masked behind the facade of corporate responsibility. Amara's frustration turned inward. Had she miscalculated? Had she been so caught up in her desire for change that she failed to consider the personal cost? She had worked tirelessly to bring awareness to the restaurant's problems, but in doing so, she had ignored the toll it was taking on her. Her activism had become an obsession, a force that had consumed her to the point where she could no longer distinguish between her own well-being and the cause she was fighting for. She wondered if she had lost sight of her own needs in the process. In her determination to fix everything around her, had she broken herself in the process? As Amara's health continued to deteriorate, she began to have moments of doubt. She started questioning her role in the larger fight for racial justice. She had entered this battle with the belief that one person, herself, could make a difference. She had believed that if she spoke out, if she pushed hard enough, things would change. But now, she wasn't so sure. She couldn't fix the systemic issues by herself. She had been so focused on the immediate goal of making the restaurant accountable that she hadn't prepared for the long, unrelenting grind of systemic change. It wasn't just about getting one restaurant to do the right thing. It was about confronting a much larger, deeply ingrained set of cultural and institutional structures that perpetuated racism and inequality. This wasn't a fight that could be won with a single victory or by wearing down one institution. It was a battle that required a collective effort, a long-term, multifaceted movement. And Amara wasn't sure she was ready to lead that movement, especially not when she felt so depleted. It was at this point that Amara began to seek therapy. Her doctor had suggested it during a routine checkup, noticing the stress she was under. At first, Amara resisted. She didn't have time for therapy. She had a mission to complete. But the pressure kept mounting, and soon she found herself sitting in a therapist's office, allowing herself to admit how overwhelmed she felt. The therapist, Dr. Patel, helped Amara work through her feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and frustration. It wasn't an easy process. Amara had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on handling adversity on her own. Admitting that she needed help felt like a failure. But as the sessions continued, Amara began to see how important it was to care for herself, not just her cause. Dr. Patel helped her understand that her desire to bring about change was noble, but it couldn't come at the expense of her own well-being. True activism, Dr. Patel explained, wasn't just about fighting for others. It was about preserving yourself so that you could continue the fight for as long as it was necessary. If Amara didn't take the time to replenish herself, she would burn out, and in doing so, she would lose the strength to continue. One of the key insights that came from therapy was the realization that Amara had been seeking external validation. She had been measuring her success by the changes she saw in the restaurant, by the applause she received from others, by the small victories. But the deeper, more important victory, true, sustained personal growth, couldn't be measured by external achievements. It was about knowing when to rest, when to step back, and when to allow others to take the lead. This was perhaps the hardest lesson for Amara to learn, that the weight of the world didn't have to be carried by her alone. Through therapy, Amara began to understand that she had been pushing herself to the brink because she hadn't taken the time to understand what she truly needed. She had needed space to grieve the failures she'd experienced. She had needed time to acknowledge the personal sacrifices she had made. Most importantly, she had needed to recognize that her own healing was integral to the work she wanted to do for others. If she didn't take care of herself, she wouldn't have the energy or the clarity to lead change in the way she had envisioned. By the end of the therapy sessions, Amara had come to a profound realization. She didn't have to be the sole architect of change. It was okay to step back, to give herself permission to heal and to rely on others. She understood now that the work she had started was important, but it was part of a larger, ongoing movement. True change required collaboration, not heroism. Her actions had set something in motion, but the responsibility for carrying that momentum forward didn't rest on her alone. Amara stood in front of her apartment window, gazing out at the city below, the skyline bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. It had been months since her intense confrontation with the restaurant, months since she had first launched herself into the struggle for racial justice within that small corner of the hospitality industry. Now, she had returned to a version of her life she hadn't known for some time, one in which the weight of her activism no longer felt like an overwhelming burden. But she was different. She had changed. In the time since her burnout, since her revelation that real change required more than just individual effort, Amara had worked to heal. She had taken time away from the front lines of activism, time that she had desperately needed. She had sought therapy, started reconnecting with her friends and family, and slowly began to rebuild her energy, piece by piece. Yet, she knew that this period of rest wasn't a retreat. It was a recalibration. It was an opportunity to understand who she was now, who she had become after all the struggles, triumphs, and setbacks. The restaurant incident, which had once been the defining challenge of her professional life, had ultimately led her to a more nuanced understanding of her place in the larger fight for social justice. In the past, she had believed that the road to change was about a series of victories, small, tangible wins that could be counted and celebrated. But now she saw the larger, more elusive truth. Change wasn't just about wins. It was about persistence, about pushing forward in the face of resistance, and about understanding that the fight for equity was ongoing and never truly over. There were always new layers to uncover, new battles to fight, and new people to bring into the fold. Amara had learned not to measure success by how much she could achieve in a given moment, but by how much she could sustain in the long term. She knew that real change didn't just happen by one person's willpower or by making a few people apologize. It was about a collective, ongoing effort to dismantle systems of oppression and privilege. This was a lifelong commitment, not a sprint, and it required more than just strategic thinking. It required emotional resilience and the humility to know when to step back, when to delegate, and when to listen. Her reflection on this brought her back to her work as a doctor. She had often struggled to balance her medical career with her activism, feeling that the two were separate, disparate aspects of her life. Now, though, she understood how they were intertwined. In both medicine and activism, the aim was the same: healing. Medicine was about diagnosing and treating physical ailments, but activism was about addressing the spiritual and emotional wounds caused by systemic injustice. She had always thought that her work as a physician was grounded in science and objectivity, but now she saw that it was just as much about compassion, empathy, and patience as it was about knowledge. It was a comforting realization, one that allowed her to let go of some of the pressure she had put on herself. She didn't need to solve every problem, change every system, or make every person see the world as she did. Her role, both as a doctor and an advocate, was to show up with integrity, to do her part, and to understand that her contribution, no matter how small, was a piece of a much larger puzzle. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of her phone. It was Derek. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks. After their last conversation, when she had made it clear that the changes at the restaurant were insufficient, Derek had seemed to retreat into the background. Now he was calling again. Amara hesitated for a moment before answering. "Amara, I hope you're doing well." Derek's voice was tentative but warm. "Hi, Derek," Amara replied, her voice more measured than it had been in the past. She no longer felt the need to rush into confrontation or solutions. She could take a more deliberate, thoughtful approach now, thanks to the lessons she had learned. "How's everything going at the restaurant?" "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation," Derek began. "We've made some real changes, and we're continuing to evaluate how things are progressing. I wanted to reach out and hear your thoughts. We know it's not perfect yet, but we're committed to moving in the right direction. I wanted to thank you for pushing us to be better." Amara smiled softly, but there was no sense of victory in her expression. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the work still to be done. "I appreciate the effort, Derek. But I want to be honest with you, these changes aren't going to be enough unless the leadership is fully committed to transformation. And that's something you can't just implement with a few new policies or a diversity seminar. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe, heard, and valued. The staff needs to see leadership that truly reflects those values, not just in words, but in everyday actions." Derek was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was more somber. "I hear you, Amara. And I agree. We've got a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing the hard work. And I'd like your help in shaping that process, if you're willing." Amara paused. She had come so far from where she was when she first stepped into that restaurant, demanding answers. She had learned that her role wasn't just about pushing for immediate change. It was about fostering an environment where ongoing dialogue could thrive. She had learned that to build a truly inclusive environment, everyone had to be involved: management, staff, customers, and the community at large. It wasn't just about her own ideas. It was about creating space for everyone to have a voice in the process. "I'm willing to help," Amara said, her voice firm yet compassionate. "But it's going to take time, Derek. And it's going to take more than just a few meetings. It's about staying the course, even when it gets hard." "I understand," Derek replied. "I'm ready for that. And I know you are too." As they finished the conversation, Amara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had stepped away from the fire for a while, allowing herself the time to heal, reflect, and recalibrate. Now, she was returning to the fray, but with a more balanced perspective. She understood the work ahead of her, and she wasn't naive about the roadblocks and frustrations that would come. But she was grounded in the knowledge that change, real change, was about patience, perseverance, and the collective effort of many, not just the work of one individual. In the days that followed, Amara continued to engage with the restaurant in a way that felt more sustainable. She participated in discussions with staff and management, encouraging open dialogue about the challenges they were facing. Her role was no longer one of a singular advocate, but of a facilitator, someone who could bring people together, who could foster the conversations that needed to happen for real progress to be made. It was slower than she had hoped, but it was steady, and that steadiness gave her a sense of purpose and fulfillment that was absent in her earlier, more frantic attempts at change. She began to reconnect with other advocates in her community, people who had been fighting similar battles for years, people who had also learned that activism was a marathon, not a sprint. Together, they worked on larger initiatives, pushing for systemic change in the city's institutions, advocating for policies that address the root causes of inequality. Amara was no longer fighting a solitary battle. She was part of something larger, something that was slowly, incrementally, but surely making a difference. Amara's return to her familiar life wasn't a retreat. It was a transformation. She had come to understand that the real work of change wasn't always about the loudest voice or the most visible victory. It was about the quiet, everyday commitment to justice, the willingness to learn, the humility to listen, and the courage to keep going, even when the road was long and uncertain. Now, as she sat at her desk, reflecting on the journey she had taken, Amara felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She hadn't won in the way she had once imagined, but she had grown, and that growth was its own kind of victory. Her life, once dominated by the need to fix everything at once, had found a new rhythm. She had learned to let go of the illusion of instant solutions, embracing the process of slow, steady progress. And perhaps, she thought as she gazed out at the horizon, that was the real answer she had been searching for all along.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.